What's up, gang? It's time for another riveting edition of the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, the show that gives you the tips and tools you need to make yourself stronger, faster, and harder to kill. You know, there's a strange disconnect I'm feeling in the air right now. If you scroll through your social media or do an internet search, you might get the impression that the United States is on the brink of a civil war. The language in the articles and the videos that you come across are apocalyptic. Pundits are already talking like it's a done deal. And it's got many people feeling like something violent and decisive is coming. And yet, apart from the rhetoric and some isolated protests and sporadic violence here and there, nothing decisive is actually happening. There's no real organized insurgencies. Yes, there's protests, there are riots, and certainly there are ideological factions willing to use violence, but we don't have an insurgency yet that can survive contact with the modern system. There's no parallel government forming, no sustained armed clashes. There's no coherent leadership issuing orders, and no meaningful, then this is key, no meaningful defections from the military or security services. So today I want to make a claim that may sound provocative, but it's actually conservative when viewed historically, and that's this. Civil war has been canceled until further notice. Not because the tensions aren't real, not because the corruption's not real, and certainly not because decline isn't real. That certainly all exists. But it's because the form of conflict, the form that the conflict takes in an advanced, bureaucratic, post-industrial society is different from what most people imagine. And in fact, probably what's coming is probably worse. So this episode is about explaining those dynamics in detail, how power is actually contested today, why violence is suppressed rather than unleashed, and what replaces civil war in a system that's hollowed out by elite competition. I'm going to take this in 2 episodes. So first, I'm going to lay the groundwork of why I don't think civil war is on the docket anytime soon, and what I think is coming or is happening instead. And then in part 2, I want to kind of try to see if we can hatch out a plan on how we're going to navigate this. All right. So before we do that, without further, I want to give a quick shout out to my subscribe paying members, those who are joined to the team room. I really appreciate you guys. If you want access to the team room, that's where we meet quarterly to discuss things like this, tactics and training and other things that are going on, where we get into a Zoom meeting or a Zoom call and we interact face to face. You ask questions and we just talk like we're sitting in a room, smoking and joking. Get on Substack, upgrade your free membership, and you will have instant access. All right, without further ado, we're talking about why the Civil War has been canceled until further notice. It's all on the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast, and we're starting right now. All right, my friends, we are back. We are back. Still recorded live from an undisclosed location south of the Mason-Dixon line. I'm your host, Mark, and this is the Pearl Snap Tactical Podcast. All right, section 1. Let's just jump into it. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not, anybody who does pretend to know what is going to happen is either just delusioned or they're a flat-out charlatan. Nobody knows. But we can make forecasts. That's kind of what we do just by analyzing. You utilize history, utilize conditions on the ground, certain principles that bear true, and you make your forecast from that. But with the understanding that even you change one of the variables in your analysis, and that can change it, that can skew your forecast. So that's what we're proceeding from. Okay, so let's roll into it, and I'll tell you why I think the Civil War has been canceled until further notice. So, Civil War is not just simply, two groups battling each other or just high. Well, let me back up. Civil War is not simply just high polarization or angry rhetoric or even sporadic violence. Historically, civil wars require a certain thing, and that is organization. You have to have a centralized leadership capable of issuing binding orders. You have to have control over an armed force on a sustained basis. And that includes being able to coordinate logistics, things like food, fuel, medical care, ammunition, and that's got to come from somewhere. That's got to be the sustainment piece has to be organized and come from somewhere. And that would require financing, right? You have to have a patron, you have to have money coming in from somewhere, and a certain degree of territorial control from where you could base your operations, have freedom of movement to a certain extent. Right. So, and you have to have a population that's willing to endure long-term hardships. Civil wars are projects; they're not moods. They're not social moods. So this immediately rules out spontaneous grassroots conflict in a modern surveillance state, right? Any bottom up attempt at coordination is visible, it is traceable, it's infiltratable, and yes, that's a real word, and disruptible, also a real word, long before it scales out. And that's the problem. I think a lot of times when people look at historical civil wars and insurgencies and everything from the past, while there's certainly many lessons there that are valuable, there are certain principles that we could learn from and use. I think that's the big thing that Civil War models kind of fail to factor in, and that's the modern surveillance state and how the regime has the ability to quash these movements or uh, or control them to a certain extent just by virtue of the surveillance state, right? And that leads to a crucial conclusion that if a civil war were to happen in the United States, it would have to be organized from the top down. And that means for all those factors that I listed above, and that means it's going to be elite driven. So, to understand why civil war is unlikely, we've got to understand how elites actually compete for power. So let's go on to that, shall we? So when I talk about elites, we're not talking about a unified ruling class or conspiracy. I'm not talking about Illuminati or all that kind of stuff, right? The stuff that's made of movies and everything. We're talking about people who control disproportionate resources, institutions, and influence. So folks like political leaders, CEOs of major global corporations, senior bureaucrats, major financial actors, media figures to a certain extent, and cultural gatekeepers. So these are groups of disparate factions that may work together in times when their goals and objectives align, but then they're just as apt to fight against each other when those goals or objectives diverge, right? I did a whole episode on this, and I've addressed it in a couple of different episodes. But the one, if you want to get spun up on it, there's an episode back in the past called "Who Are the Global Elites?" I've got a link in the Substack notes if you're reading along, right there, and you can go back and listen to that. And one of the researchers and analysts that I cite in that episode is Peter Turchin, who's kind of got a mathematical model that he brings to the table that's very interesting. But his key insight is that instability comes from elite overproduction. So, in other words, too many elite or counter elites or people who aspire to be elite, they're competing for too few high status, high power positions, right? There's just not enough apples in the cart to go around, so to say, right? And so when that happens, people start competing against the other. So competition intensifies, norms erodes, institutions are weaponized, right, against certain groups, which leads to an increase in corruption, and legitimacy itself declines. But here's the critical point that is often misunderstood is that elite competition, and I'm talking within the modern era, does not aim at destroying the system. Because the system is the arena in which the elites compete, right? It's a system where everyone knows the rules, they know how to bend the rules, and they can work very comfortably within that framework, right? So there's no need to destroy it, which is what a civil war would do. It would destroy the arena in which they're competing, right? So it's the source of their wealth, their protection, and their authority, right? So destroying it would be to destroy their own positions, right? It would be too risky, right? There would be you would insert a variable that uh, is unknown and harder to control. So instead of an open war, elites fight within the system. So let's talk about how this conflict is actually waged today. So modern elite conflict it's not kinetic, or not primarily kinetic, it's administrative, it's legal, it's economic and narrative driven. We have all seen examples of this within I mean, you go back, but I would say intensifying particularly from 2016 on now, right? Power is contested through bureaucratic capture. So you capture the institution, you control the certain institution, right? So that you can draft regulatory rules, right? You can then enforce those rules selectively, and you can exempt people like your buddies and cronies from enforcement. You gain control of the funding and the credit system, right? You control the legal prosecution, so you can prosecute certain people in certain groups and then offer immunity to others, right? And then narrative framing and reputational destruction, canceling people, right? Though that's the dynamics of the struggle and the conflict, right? And that's the arena that the elites are particularly good at playing in, right? So this is slower than violence, right? It doesn't achieve the goals maybe as fast as just uprooting your competition through violence, but what you gain, uh, what you lose in terms of speed, you gain as far as controllable factors, right? It's much more controllable, right? So think of it as attritional conflict rather than just a decisive battle. So the goal here is not to mobilize the population to fight for you. The goal is to neutralize it and discipline it. Right now, what do I mean by discipline? So that phrase, kind of discipline in the population, that sounds abstract. So let's make it concrete. So when I say discipline, I'm not talking about working out when you don't feel like it or putting down that donut as an exercise of willpower. I'm especially not when the population is concerned. I'm talking about the ability to sanction an individual, right? Discipline is the ability to sanction an individual or a group to induce compliance, right? To get them to do what you want to do, to get them to shut up or to stand down, right? To discipline a population is to shape its behavior without mobilizing enthusiasm or loyalty. And modern states do this through a lot of layered constraints. So there's economic discipline. So the regime can discipline you in a sense or corral you or gain your compliance right through economics. So creating inflation that erodes your savings, debt limits, personal debt mounts up, right? And that limits personal risk taking. People are less likely to put their neck out on the line when their livelihoods are threatened. So employment and the licensing gate and access is really your access to survival. So if you can control that, put the squeeze on that, you get a compliant populace. You can also have the leverage of legal and administrative discipline. So you can create complex regulations, right, that increase compliant costs. So selective enforcement, right, can deter dissent, right? Administrative penalties then replace criminal trials. And we've seen that in the last few years, that a lot of people have been controlled, not really by the government, but just by corporations deplatforming people, right? People who were trying to get their put their footprint online, whether they were trying to offer alternate points of views to become kind of like an influencer or talking head or social media personality or whatever. We've seen people like that be deplatformed, be canceled, right? And all that administratively without the need of arresting them and putting them on trial on trumped up charges, right? So the regime and these elites, right, don't think just government, right, but the elites, they can get compliance through administrative and legal means. Digital and information discipline. So surveillance in and of itself normalizes self-censorship, right? Platform moderation, disruption coordination, right? Or disrupts coordination, right? Financial monitoring restricts movements and resources. I have over my time of just traveling and doing what I've come across certain people in courses and stuff like that. That we just, hey, how'd you hear about the class? Did you see it on Facebook? Did you see it on social media? Oh no, I don't follow. I don't have a social media account. I don't want them to see me. I don't want to be monitored. But the fact of the matter is, you carry a cell phone around. If it's a smartphone, you are being monitored. Even without the cell phone, your transactions are financially being tracked. And I would submit to you that someone could just by tracing your where you go, how you spend your day, the locations you frequent, and how you spend your money, and the fact that you don't have certain social media accounts can say just as much about you as someone creating a spreadsheet of what posts you liked and what ones you didn't like. Anyway, just saying. Social discipline. So reputation systems punish deviation, right? Credentialing systems control participation, and social ostracism, whether it's online or in real life, right, replaces debate. So all these forms of discipline, economic, legal, digital, social, they train or they indoctrinate the individual to internalize limits, right, and to avoid risk, not putting their neck out. It produces compliance without overt coercion. So over time, people just learn that pushing back is costly, coordination is risky, and deviation is punished, leaving them, and the result is it leaves them frustrated, but cautious, and largely disengaged rather than mobilized. And that's why the unrest simmers rather than ignites, right? Everyone's dissatisfied, everyone's frustrating, but the people who are struggling to make a living, who have the most to lose, are less likely to put that at risk, right? Because of the internal discipline and constraints that are put into place. And then this is really the kicker right here, and that is how the surveillance state and prevents mass movements. So one of the most important dynamics that prevents today's elite competition from spilling into a full-scale civil war is something that previous declining civilizations just didn't possess, and that's a mature surveillance state. Now, I'm not talking about like just a dystopian science fiction, George Orwellian type thing, but just a layered bureaucratic, right, with a largely invisible system that monitors communication, finance, movement, and social networks in real time, which I guess is rather Orwellian. But anyway, moving on. So historically, mass movements required three things to mature into rebellion. So they had to, what are they? They had to have the ability to organize privately, right? They had to have the ability to coordinate at scale, and then the ability to experiment, to fail, right? Try different attacks, try different angles. And if those things didn't work, they could regroup, have a place to safely reconstitute without being immediately suppressed. And today, especially in Western society, none of those conditions really exist for grassroots movements anymore, right? Digital communication is logged. Financial transactions are traceable, right? Information networks are mapped through social media, metadata, platform analytics. So even when the state itself is not actively intervening, corporations, platforms, and financial institutions function as a parallel enforcement mechanisms. So that cuts off visibility, funding, or reach long before the movement can cohere. And there are numerous examples, right, of where there were political movements that were gaining ground, that were growing, and then they were getting their message. And this is just one example, getting their message across through social media, and then boom, cut off, deplatformed, and over time, without the ability to fundraise and get their word out, right? It just, where are those groups now? They're basically nowhere, right? Now, certain of those groups are still allowed to operate because the elites, right? If that's one that the elites like, that they can use, that they can manipulate and exploit to their ends, they'll certainly allow those to remain, to organize, but they control them so that they don't get out of control and form a mass movement, right? And come into their own. All right. So the result is that potential rebellions are stopped when they are in the gestational phase. So they never really reach the point where ideology, leadership, logistics, and popular legitimacy can align. All those things that I talked about in the very beginning, right? That civil wars need in order to happen. Those things just aren't allowed to take off and mature and come into their own. So instead of facing tanks in the streets, movements encounter account suspensions, banking restrictions, algorithmic suppression, legal pressure, right? Targeted prosecution, those types of things. The system doesn't need to crush uprisings. It prevents them from becoming mass in the first place. And so this really isn't a repression in the classical sense of the word, like you would see in your history books. It's just preemption. And so this fundamentally, I think, alters the trajectory of elite conflict. Even when factions attempt to mobilize certain popular support, they're forced to do so through the existing institutional channels that are already being monitored and regulated. And that means elite competition stays within the system, not because the elites are benevolent, and certainly not because they're unified, but because the environment makes extra institutional mass mobilization prohibitively risky and really almost impossible to sustain. All right. So why? So you might be saying, all right, at this point you may be asking, well, if the elites are competing so fiercely, why wouldn't one faction just try to seize power outright from the other? Right. And that's the reason why, is because the risk it's too much. So I had to take a drink of water there, folks. All right. So because civil war introduces risks that elites can't control, right? You have civil wars are expensive, they're costly, and they're destructive. They destroy the asset values that these elites hold, right? There's a breakdown of enforcement. You run the risk of having foreign intervention. And I'm not talking about foreign influence. We certainly have that, right? But I'm talking about foreign intervention. I'm talking about troops on your soil, right? And that's a whole nother thing that brings in, you might be opening Pandora's box there. There's fragmentation of authority, and just all of that has to do with this loss of predictability. So elite competition favors a contained conflict, not open warfare, right? Now, I'm not saying that civil wars don't happen, that elites don't, finally cross the bridge too far. This certainly has happened historically, could still happen. But right now, the conditions don't favor that. Things have changed in the West to where I think the rules of the game just don't favor and lean towards an all-out civil war. Because civil war is not the tool that it used to be, right? That truly is a failure, a state failure, right? And these people want to keep the state intact. They just want to hollow it out for their own self-aggrandizement. right? So then what that happens to you on the individual level, right, is bringing this down to lived experience is that inflation rises, right? Wages stagnate and housing and assets become unreachable. And when that happens, then the debt expands and opportunity for social mobility narrows. And so it seems like that they're doing this intentionally or that there's some grand master plan, but and I'm sure maybe for some there are some bad actors who maybe that is true, but ultimately it's just structural. It's just what happens as a result of this elite competition when they're much more just out for themselves, and then you and I suffer as a result, right? So the system protects these things. So the system, because again, to have an all-out civil war would put this at risk, and that's not what they want, and that is putting their assets at risk, right? So by assets, I mean large, systematically important concentration of capital. So things like banks, financial markets, major corporations, real estate portfolios, government debts, stuff like that. So when markets crash, liquidity appears. When banks fail, they're merged or rescued, right? We've had that. Remember, too big to fail, the bailouts and things like that, right? The elites can keep these assets in play, even though you may suffer in your bank book. They can protect themselves because they write the regulations and they create the rules by which these systems operate. So when asset prices wobble, right, there's a policy then bends down to stabilize them. So now that doesn't mean that the asset holders always win in the short term, but it does mean that the system is designed to prevent a catastrophic loss at the top, even if the volatility is pushed downward to you and me. Right. So another one are institutions. Institutions are preserved even when they fail, right? Bureaucracies usually tend to expand after a crisis rather than shrink, right? Um, Agencies with that miss warnings are, instead of punished, right, they're usually given more, awarded with more authority, right? Rules are rewritten to protect the institution's continuity, not necessarily its competence. And so this really creates the institutional inertia that the system prioritizes survival of the structure, not trust or performance, right? Again, it goes back to what is the arena that the elites compete in? It's the existing system as they try to, as they're fighting each other, right? And corruption increases and they're hollowing out the system and fleecing everybody so that they get richer and more powerful, right? That causes, it's an abuse of the systems, right? And so then when those systems fail, instead of letting them fail or trying to heal them, they just continue dragging the corpse around by keeping it intact through bureaucracy and through rewriting the rules and things like that, because it allows the system to remain in place, which is their arena that they can fight, and they continue to draw power, wealth, influence, and everything to themselves. Do you see how that cycle works, right? And so the elites are very much insiders, right, to all this, and so they have the credentialed access, the network proximity, right? And then they have the insulation from the legal, financial, and political ramifications. So, these aren't immune it doesn't mean that they're immune to the consequences, because again, these folks are fighting each other, and there's going to be some people that some groups that suffer defeats, but they're buffered from the worst ones. And so mistakes that would destroy an ordinary person's livelihood often result for insiders a quiet exit, lateral moves, consultancy roles, right? How many disgraced politicians, have been caught up in some scandal, and then next thing you know, they're a lobbyist, right? They get run out of office, they get defeated there, but then they roll into some lobbying group where they're making millions every year, right? Some kind of soft landing, things like that, right? The system is designed to protect them in a certain sense because they know how to navigate it and they're in that position to do so, where you and I aren't. So who's the losers in this? Well, I think you know this one's coming, right? So the system will extract labor, right? It extracts from labor, small operators, and the people in the middle, right? So extraction doesn't mean theft. Although that can be a part of it, but it means cost shifting, right? So labor absorbs the inflation, right? Job instability, benefits erosion, right? Increased productivity demands without proportional compensation. And so when the system needs flexibility, it gets it from the workers, not the institutions. And I certainly don't mean to sound like a Marxist here, because I'm certainly not, but that is a real dynamic, right? Um, uh, I mean, Marx did identify that as an issue. It's just the way he framed everything and the other dynamics in place that I disagree with. But even a broken clock is right twice a day. So, and also I mentioned small operators. So these are small businesses, independent contractors. They are the ones that face the regulatory burdens that they can't amortize, right? They don't have the bandwidth to comply with all the regulations, and new rules that like a Fortune 1 company would, right? Compliance cost, right? Designed for larger firms that they can't do. They can't create conditions to favor scale, right? So they don't fail dramatically. They just disappear, right? And then the middle class really becomes a shock absorber. So higher taxes without higher services, asset inflation, which is reduced access to housing, education, healthcare, reduced mobility, upward mobility, right? And that just creates a more destabilizing middle class, right? And they're the ones that get the squeeze put on them, right? So then you would think, well, good grief, man, that's how civil war happens, right? Is it not? I mean, isn't that what causes these folks to get angry enough to take up arms against the government and stuff like that? Well, I think in times past, yeah, but we have different things now that are operating on history that are operating on us today that historically just hasn't been there, right? And that's the key insight, is that when people, the whole point of the ability to discipline the population under the banner of a surveillance state is that you exploit people, right, to where they feel powerless. And if they feel powerless, they don't revolt. And what they do instead is just disengage. And so rebellion requires at least three things. And that's, if you're going to rebel, you got to have a hope for success. You have to have trust in certain allies, right? That other people are going to help. They're going to pitch in, and there has to be a belief that if you stick your neck out on the line and you pay the ultimate price, that sacrifice matters. But if you can condition the population into withdrawal, then you don't have any of that, right? And then when you get people disengage, right? So in civic life, voting just becomes symbolic. Local involvement in the community drops. And then public discourse is just treated as theater, right? I mean, all these guys on Twitter or X and YouTube, I don't care what side of the aisle on. I'm not just talking about the libs. I mean, I see this on the right as well. I mean, these guys are just talking. They're not discussing anything meaningful. All they're doing is getting likes, they're getting notoriety, they're getting ad revenue and stuff like that just by fanning the flames and keeping it up. But they're not offering any solutions. They're not doing anything. They're just keeping you. They're part of the problem, quite frankly, and just keeping you stirred up to where in the end it's just theater is all it is, right? And yeah, so. Again, so people disengage from civic life. They're not loyal to the institutions. Employers are just transactional. Professions lose prestige. National narratives kind of feel hollow, and institutions just become something you use. They're not something you belong to, right? Like there was in the past. So, when it comes time to, by demoralizing the population, right? Even if they want to fight, well, what are they fighting to preserve? What are they fighting for, right? Because they've already the elites have already ran roughshod over the institutions, and people aren't even loyal to them anymore, right? And then lastly, long-term planning, and this is probably the most corrosive effect, because people stop saving for their future, right? People are stop having children, right? They stop investing in a place or their community, and they stop believing that their sacrifices are going to pay off. And so, life just collapses into a shorter time horizon of survival, right? Comfort, exit strategy. Let me go to work, let me do my thing, let me go home, sit on the couch with a beer and a bag of potato chips and watch Netflix, right? No need to go out and engage, no need to be part of something, right? It's just through those levers of discipline that I talked about each other. That's how you can keep a population angry, frustrated, but controlled, right? And so and that's why civil war doesn't happen, because the population itself is fragmented, right? We're so hyper individualized and so atomized, right? Everybody's in their own little victim group, right? And some of these are at cross purpose with each other. So they're fragmented, they're separated, easier to control, financially stressed, closely monitored, and really psychologically exhausted, right? And psychologically exhausted people, they don't mobilize, right? And they're just atomized people. And atomized populations are far easier to manage than rebellious ones, even if they're deeply unhappy. And that's how systems hollow out without exploding, right? That's what I'm trying to say. All right, now, having said all that, I have often made reference to historical patterns. So let's look at a couple of the big key ones that I think people tend to cite. And that's the Roman Empire, moving from the Roman Republic to empire, which happened as a result of civil war, and the 1960s, right? Which there was certainly a lot of rebellious, definitely a time that rebellion was in the zeitgeist, right? So let's address that. Didn't Rome go through elite competition, and didn't it end in civil war? And the answer is absolutely yes, it did. But the details here matter. So let's look at what the Roman Republic had. All right. So did have elite overproduction. All right. Check. Did have a debt crisis, which can sometimes facilitate civil war, oftentimes does. Check. Had land concentration, right? Institutional paralysis. The system was broke, right? But the Civil War came after decades of decay, and they were elite led. The Civil War was elite led. That's a big thing to note. It was fought by professional armies that were loyal to individuals. And that is huge, right? And it was triggered when the administrative options were exhausted. So Rome didn't collapse just because people were angry. It didn't collapse just because the system was broke and people were dissatisfied, and one side got so angry at the other they decided to take up arms. No, that's not what happened. Right? It collapsed because essentially the governance itself failed. Right? And so then you think, well, why couldn't that happen to America? Well, modern America differs in some key ways, and that is this. And I think this is probably one of the bigger ones, and that is modern America. The professional military is loyal to the institution. It's not loyal to the general, right? It's not loyal first to the commanding officer, right? So if you look back in the Roman Empire, when Caesar was marching across the Rubicon with his legion, with the 13th Legion or whatever, I mean, his legions or his men were loyal to him, right? So they were going to do what he said, even if it was to take up arms against their brother, right? A neighboring legion that was commanded by Pompey or somebody, somebody else, right? And so that's a big one right there. And so you look at the American military. I mean, the leaders today, they just don't. They're not given that option to create that type of loyalty. Your command slots, right? Even from the time you're a lieutenant to the time you're a general, right? You go and do command time. So as a platoon leader, you're going to do your time as a platoon leader, right? Where you command, you know, say a rifle platoon of 30, 45 guys, whatever, of guys, right? Then you move to that may just be a year and a half, right? And same thing as company commander. He's going to roll in there, and it's just check box or box checking, right? They go in there, they do their command time. You might have a good commander, but you might only see him for a year and a half, and then boom, he's gone. You get a new one, right? It's so they can get their command time to get ready for the next position, right? So these guys don't spend their career there with the boys, right? To garner that type of loyalty where someone is going to risk life and limb, the safety of their family, their livelihood and everything on on doing something extreme because their leader wants them to do, because they trust their leader. That's not baked in the cake in modern militaries, right? Versus Caesar, who's fought, bled on the battlefield with his men, took them to the extremes, and then, hey man, in the low times and the high times, right, looting villages, right, allowing them to loot and enrich themselves off the land that they conquered. That was part of it. So a lot of benefits. If you have a good commander back in the day, you could really assuming you survived, right, you could really do well for yourself by the time you hit retirement. So you'd be willing to do extreme things for that person, right? And then something else that I mentioned earlier, right? How we differ, just the modern surveillance state and the ability to enforce things quickly and disproportionately, right? That just wasn't there. You're talking about an antiquity where you want to get a message to someone to try to coordinate something. It could take weeks, it might even take longer, right? It might take months to get there, right? And to try to coordinate that, it's just difficult. And then now we're just so deeply and financially and globally entangled, right? It's just a lot harder to pull those things off. And so that raises the threshold for what would be needed for an open conflict dramatically. So that's why I think there's a lot of lessons that we can get from the Romans, but I just don't think it's a one-to-one comparison. Let's talk about the 1960s. So this comparison feels intuitive, but I think it's misleading also. So in the 1960s, you had a very young, idealistic population, right? You had a lot of rapid economic growth, right? Because think about the people who were charged, the World War II vets, the greatest generation, that they built up these institutions and all that. You had expanded opportunity, and you had high social trust, and you had limited surveillance. So there was surveillance, obviously, but it's just not like it was today, right? And when I say high social trust, even though you're like, well, weren't all these dope smoking hippies out there, these college kids out there, protesting against the system? Yes. But what I mean is the high social trust means that the people believed that the institutions were legitimate, that they were functional, and what they wanted to do was reform them, not destroy them. And today we have the opposite. We have an older population, we have economic stagnation, we have very low institutional trust, and then we have a total information saturation, and then fragmented identities, right? So you have several of these groups, right? Some of these groups may even be violent or rebellious, right? But they are they might just as easily be opposed to the other as they would be in alignment on certain issues, right? So just that the energy is there, it's just the cohesion's not. So what replaces civil war then? So if civil war doesn't come, then what does? And I think in some respects this might be even worse. not to just doom everybody, but we've got to. It's real talk right now. In the next episode, we'll talk about how we navigate it, but it's real talk right now. So what is in its place is managed decline. So, like I said, the core sectors are protected. The assets that these people continue to pilfer, to loot, those things are still in place, but the peripheral areas degrade. Rules continue to be enforced selectively, so you hope and pray you're not on the wrong group, right? That you're not on the wrong end of that. And as that happens, then competency declines, right? Because the institutions are being used by the elites, and not for their own self-aggrandizement and not for the benefit of the country, right? And so that's what we have. So the state will persist, but it's uneven, it's coercive, and it's less effective, while the elites cannibalize the system to draw power, wealth, and influence to themselves. So that's what we're in, and that's in some ways just as bleak, if not more, than if we just had an all-out civil war and just rebuilt from there. Let's talk about some variables. So, like I said, not a prediction, just a projection. So, what are some things that could change my point of view? What were some things that if I saw, I could be like, yeah, if this happens, that could totally send us into a tailspin in a different direction. So, that would be just a severe economic collapse. I'm not talking about a recession. I mean, I'm just talking about a major collapse, right? Just the whole thing, the bottom falls out. And, even the elites don't have a place, they scramble like roaches and even they don't have a place to go safely, like something like that. It would have to be so catastrophic. A major military defeat, right? Not something like us leaving Afghanistan, not something like Vietnam. Like it would have to be a major conventional style defeat, right? Something like that could probably turn the tide. Technological disruption beyond control, right? So if for some reason a rogue nation state was to, detonate a nuke or an EMP attack, right? Or, just something crazy like that. Yeah, that could, to where the whole system was destroyed, or couldn't function, then that's when all bets are off. An internal security fracture. So that could be something, meaning you would have to have like large scale defection of the military to a certain side, versus, or some major defection within the security apparatus, right? That could be something, or a succession crisis. If we've had rumblings of that, they certainly threaten it, but it hasn't happened yet. But if you had an election and one side just absolutely refused to accept it and willing to go to blows for it, then that could change things up. So having looked through all those bullets, those are very low probability. But if they're high impact events. I mean, they'd be a doozy. I mean, I ain't gonna lie about it, but I just, and I'm not saying it's not possible. I just think it's very low probability. So absent them, what's going to happen is decline is going to continue without explosion. And really, historically speaking, I think that's the norm, right? Versus civil war. All right, so let's wrap it up. So civil war has it, like I said, civil war is not canceled until further notice because everything's fine, right? It's been canceled because modern systems in the West suppress decisive conflict, even as they decay. So collapse doesn't arrive with banners and battles, right? It arrives through miscalculation, through attrition, and just exhaustion. And so by the time it's obvious to everybody, the options to do anything are already gone, right? And if that's got you feeling bleak, I get it. But I'm not in the habit of just serving up doom slop. So I do want to set the stage for the next installment, which focuses on what we're to do about it. So let's start with where we're at. All right. Let's just look each other eye in the eye, eyeball to eyeball. And so, if you're feeling like this seems hopeless, is actually a rational response to correctly perceiving the situation. Most people feel despair right now because they sense something's wrong, but they can't really name it. But you know it, you feel it because you can now name it. You know what we're up against, and that's a very important distinction. And so let's get grounded and practical about it, because I think at this point the mistake that a lot of people are making out there in the interwebs and with talking heads and the news stories that people are sharing with each other is that they feel like there's only two options, and that's either there's a revolution or a resignation, meaning you're just gonna bend over and take it, right? And historically, those are false choices. So what I was gonna follow in the next installment is not a bunch of motivational fluff. I'm going to sketch out a plan or an individual strategy for people who are inside managing decline. Now, again, like I said at the beginning, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I could say this is. I'm not going to hold myself out as saying this is the way and this will make all your problems go away and stuff like that. I don't have that. And quite frankly, nobody does. I don't care what their background is, however impressive it is. Nobody has that. But what we can do is just try to glean from things in the past and find the things that are similar, while recognizing, like we did with the Roman Empire, the things that are different, right? And try to develop a strategy based on that, on how we can navigate on it. So I will also warn you that this is not about beating the system, right? No, it's not about escaping out into the woods or living out of a bunker or waiting for some dramatic point. It's just learning. It's about learning how people historically survived, adapted, and even thrived inside long periods of managed decline by adjusting their expectations and tightening up their dependencies, and really just assessing, what can be control, what can you control, and then reclaiming control of that, right? That's where we're going to go next in that one. So think about what I've said, mull it over, and then get ready for the next episode. So guys, until then, I appreciate your support. Until then, stay sharp and keep it Pearl Snap.